The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Barwon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In June last year, when the pandemic was entering a particularly acute phase in Australia, the New South Wales Government suspended Parliament. Faced with a sudden, rapid rise in COVID-19 case numbers and apparently acting on health advice that we never saw, they put a temporary stop to the normal democratic process. We were the only state in Australia to do so. On the face of it, that might have seemed to be a good idea, given that health advice warned against any large indoor gatherings, which is what Parliament basically is, because research showed that large gatherings of people were a major vector for spreading the disease. But while there may have been a pretext for it at the time, the suspension went on for months longer than it should have. Once the fog of confusion had passed and a clearer view of what was happening emerged, the government should have recalled Parliament to chart a path to safety. While the state continued to operate, as it always does because of amazing people working at a local level, at the highest level, the government bunkered down, continuing to issue orders and make decisions, but without the usual checks and balances afforded by a sitting Parliament. While it might be argued that the unprecedented public health emergency necessitated unprecedented measures, suspending Parliament was actually counterproductive because it narrowed the government's vision at a time when they should have been more open to a wider range of solutions to the crisis and to be more transparent to the public, who were confused, concerned about what was happening, and who needed to be better informed. It left many people feeling abandoned and helpless. In the report from the February 2022 Munich Security Conference, an annual meeting where matters of international security are discussed at a high level, they talked about the global sense of learned helplessness that has come about as a result of a series of global crises facing us, among them the pandemic. The report said that this sense of helplessness, the feeling that nothing can be done about our dire situation, has resulted in our liberal democratic institutions coming under fire. To quote the report, this perception is highly dangerous because it can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Societies that have concluded they cannot solve humankind's most challenging problems might no longer even try to turn the tide. It further says that this is the time we should be shoring up our democratic institutions. The combination of strong democracy at home and reliable cooperation among democracies abroad is still the best hope for dealing with these challenges. By suspending Parliament for as long as it did, the government undermined our democracy, and it went further than that. Calls for papers were held up for months, making a mockery of the government's claims to be transparent and accountable. One of the fundamental principles of democratic government is that the incumbent administration opens itself up to the scrutiny of other elected representatives. It allows voices from outside the party in power to call the government to account for its actions, to point out the problems with what it is doing and draw attention to any other oversights. When a government ignores these checks and balances, it can run into serious problems. The exchange of ideas is a vital part of the democratic process. It allows a range of voices to be heard and points of view argued. As a result, the ideas that are best for the people and the running of the state can emerge. It is also essential to avoid problems such as self-interest or blind prejudice creeping into public administration. The idea of an assembly where ideas regarding the future of the people and the running of the state that can be discussed is an ancient one, going back to at least 3000 BC in Mesopotamia, when the power of their king was restrained by assemblies. Those gatherings inspired the more famous assemblies of ancient Greece. Over the centuries, while monarchs, tyrants and dictators have often ruled without the advice of assemblies, the representative assembly has emerged time and again. In Rome, Switzerland, Iceland and even amongst the Vikings. In the 20th century, the era where many nations adopted broad suffrage, some political leaders used state emergencies to bypass democracy, but usually to their detriment. Whatever the motives, whatever the crisis, governing without a sitting Parliament leaves a government vulnerable to making bad decisions, ones that are blind to the sort of local realities and peculiarities that only members from that electorate would know. Even with a global emergency, especially with a global emergency, it is a dangerous precedent to set to move away from democracy in any way. And Madam Speaker, I'd really like to thank the 20,000 plus people who took the time to sign this petition in a very short amount of time. There was a huge amount of support from the community to see this matter debated, and I really hope that we can learn from the previous shutting down of the Parliament and hope that we never see that happen again. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank the member for Barwon. The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Coffs Harbour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to make a contribution to the debate on the petition presented by the member for Barwon. The petition states that under our former Premier we have seen calamity and chaos. Madam Speaker, I frankly find that assertion to be ludicrous. Under the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals, we faced every challenge a pandemic has thrown at us and risen to every challenge. I was actually in Parliament House when we had our first lockdown. I was here for a committee hearing back in March 2 years ago, and I do remember that panic that set in because we have frankly never done this before in our nation's history, to my knowledge. And there were society-wide implications for having lockdowns like that, and I think let's hope that we don't have to go back to those again. It certainly hasn't been easy, but since then we've been working hard as a government to keep our communities safe, but also on the flip side to keep our society as open as we possibly can, and support businesses where we can as well. Businesses have seen record supports from our government, billions of dollars in all the various support programs. We've seen schools remain open for as long as possible. And I just want to congratulate and single out the Honourable Sarah Mitchell, who, unlike other states, unlike Labor state like Queensland, we did not need to push back our school opening date. We opened on day one. Rapid antigen tests were sourced and provided in quite a large logistical exercise, spreading the breadth and width of the state to ensure that people were able to get those tests and continue education in a safe way. We met the challenge of getting our whole population, or as much of our population as possible, vaccinated within a very short window. And while that might seem less of a challenge for people here in the metropolitan area, certainly I know in regional areas like the member for Barwon seat, the member for Murray seat, and even on the North Coast, it presented its own logistical challenges, but our government, in conjunction with the federal government, was able to meet those challenges. And I do acknowledge the member for Dubbo is here as well, and the now Minister for Western New South Wales, the challenges that were faced in his electorate and in the neighbouring electorates to the west. Obviously some challenges there. The support to families through the Dine and Discover vouchers, Parents New South Wales and the Stay in New South Wales vouchers have a dual support where they're supporting families but also stimulating the economy at a time that it needs stimulus. I'll go back to my notes. As a government, obviously we're not afraid of being held to account. That is the job of the opposition and the crossbench. And that was true during the Delta outbreak, the Omicron outbreak, and obviously the first Alpha outbreak. I do want to note that Parliament was shut for only a very short period, that we were back here in October. I believe we lost 4 sitting weeks, which is 12 sitting days, and we made half of that time up before the end of the year was out. I also acknowledge that the Minister, in particular, the Minister for Health, has always had a very generous policy with sharing his phone number and his contact details widely, and that members of the crossbench and opposition often had better luck getting through to him than what we did. So I'm only joking. But certainly I know he's been very accommodating to members of the opposition and crossbench in terms of giving information and being very open and available to them. The former Deputy Premier, the Honourable John Barilaro, also had regular Zoom meetings with all regional members of Parliament to keep them abreast and updated of the situation and the evolving situation in New South Wales. And I know that many members of the opposition and crossbench took advantage of those regular Zoom meetings as well. Look, our regional communities were probably more vulnerable to a large-scale COVID outbreak than what metropolitan communities were. We have smaller hospitals, we have fewer hospitals, and we have just less resources than what is here in major metropolitan New South Wales. So we needed to make sure that our communities were safe, and at that time the vast majority of New South Wales was unvaccinated, and the challenges of the Delta variant meant that we had to keep people out of risk, and one of the biggest risks that was presented to the community at that time was members of Parliament coming into Sydney and then returning home, because we have seen in other places that is how COVID spread through delivery drivers and the like. So I'll conclude by saying there was no calamity, no chaos, just the government who is innovating to allow Australia's oldest parliament to continue amidst a once-in-a-century pandemic.
Madam Speaker.
The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Orange.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Barwon for sponsoring this petition to the House. This is an important debate as it's fundamentally about democracy. When the government suspended Parliament sittings, the 24,511 petitioners responded, demanding the government recall the New South Wales Parliament immediately to discuss and vote on ongoing lockdown regulations and other important parliamentary business. During Premier Berejiklian's daily COVID meeting briefing on the 21st of August 2021, she said, and I quote, "I'm the Premier of the largest state in Australia and I expect to be held to account. I expect every decision that we, the New South Wales Government, take to be scrutinised." If the former Premier was genuine with her words, then she would have brought back Parliament to allow for scrutiny, transparency and accountability. In fact, she did the very opposite. She suspended sittings, which conveniently removed this scrutiny by the democratically elected members of this House. During this unprecedented suspension of Parliament, the community of New South Wales copped the wrath of the government's policy on the run, which had devastating financial and dramatic lifestyle implications to the citizens of this state. Had Parliament been sitting, this government would have had to face the tough questions. As an example, one of the many poor decisions made by this government, which they evaded scrutiny over because Parliament was suspended, was their COVID-19 roadmap to freedom and the unfair trade restrictions imposed on businesses. It was a dog's breakfast. It wasn't just inequitable, it was inconsiderate and inconsistent. The trade restrictions contained within the roadmap applied a 4 square metre rule. However, in the case of hairdressing and nail salons, it was capped at a maximum of 5 people, irrespective of the total area of the individual salon. Pubs weren't being limited to a maximum number of patrons, so long as they stuck to the 4 square metre rule. A hair salon in Orange, whose owner was being financially impacted by this unfair decision, was large enough to comfortably cater for all 6 of her staff and up to 12 clients under the 4 square meterage rule, but the government imposed a random cap of 5 people. That made no sense at all, as hairdresser clients are typically by appointment and they're seated for the duration of the visit, whereas a pub typically had people wandering to and from a bar, and there's bound to be increased interaction among a greater number of people. I'm not singling out pubs, but it's a comparison which highlights one of the many inconsistent and unfair decisions by this government which wasn't able to be scrutinised because they shut down Parliament and roadblocked democracy. The litany of health order restrictions imposed on all of us were unable to be challenged here, and our community's freedom was being subject to terms and conditions. Each of the members of this House were elected by their communities to represent them and to challenge government decisions which impact them. That process was removed and denied by the suspension of Parliament. I note the current Premier provided a written response to this petition and obfuscated blame for the decision to suspend sittings, stating, and I quote, "Postponement of scheduled sittings is a matter for the presiding officers," end quote. Yet he then referred to Sessional Order 47A that the government may, in the public interest, write to the Speaker and request an alternate day or hour for the next meetings of the House. The Premier further wrote in his response to that additional sittings were held in November, as the member for Coffs Harbour alluded to make up for the period Parliament was suspended. But November sittings didn't help Orange-based hair salons in July or August, salons whose owners, salons who were being financially impacted and devastated, whose elected members were unable to vigorously represent them here, to hold the government to account and to scrutinise their decisions. I called for the introduction of remote sittings to alleviate a total suspension of Parliament, but the government were very slow to adapt. It was completely foreseeable that the pandemic was not going to quickly pass, and moves to facilitate remote sittings ought to have been made far sooner, if for nothing else, for the sake of keeping up with the 21st century. Age doesn't necessarily translate to wisdom. The New South Wales Parliament is the oldest parliament in Australia and the last to adapt to electronically assisted remote sittings.
Thank the member for Orange. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for the North Shore.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We all know that New South Wales has set the benchmark for other states in Australia with its response to COVID since the pandemic began. And that is not by accident. It's by the work of this Parliament, by people across this Parliament, the presiding officers, the staff of the Parliament, people from every single party, people from the government, people working from the crossbench and opposition, working together for the community to support particularly our frontline health workers, emergency service workers who delivered the response to COVID. And we did it all because of the advice that we received from the experts. We made decisions the best we could at the time with the information we had at hand in an unprecedented circumstance for us here in New South Wales and across the globe. And we relied on the people who knew best. The decisions made for this Parliament, I respect because they were made with the best intentions and the best advice and the best information we had at that time. I respect the decisions made for New South Wales for the same reasons. And I think in this place everyone would agree with the spirit of the member for Barwon bringing forward this motion to talk about scrutiny, transparency, accountability. That's why we're all here. It's why we should all be here. But the notion that we can pretend about the Delta outbreak in New South Wales and the devastating consequences of that to people's lives and livelihoods, and pretend that we didn't need to respond to that and keep people safe in our own workplace and across this entire state is naive at best. To turn up so many months later and debate what we should have done back in Delta when we were seeing incredible impacts across the community, I'm not sure what we should have done differently. Should we have made people that have underlying health conditions turn up to Parliament to work? Should we have made attendants and staff, parliamentary workers, Hansard, catering, cleaning, attend this place to make sure we could turn up to work, we could continue to have our say, in order to make sure that we have our voice while denying the voice and the well-being and health and safety of every other person within this precinct? I don't agree with the premise of what's been put to us today, because I believe that the health advice, chiefly led by our Chief Health Officer, Dr. Kerry Chant, whom we have relied upon with such incredible respect, precision, ethics, integrity throughout this entire 2-year period, I think that advice continues to stand. When we sat in here on the 22nd of June last year for our budget, we were all sitting in this chamber, every single one of us, thinking that things had changed. The whole world, all of Australia thought things had changed. And on that very day, we were impacted by an outbreak within our own building, Madam Speaker. These are the kinds of circumstances faced across New South Wales. Considering that we are a melting pot of every single community across this state, to force everybody to return to this building, members, staff and support, for that period of time would have been negligent, Madam Speaker. I support the decisions of the presiding officers to do so. And I would note and acknowledge what some of our colleagues have mentioned. The government, the Parliament, all sides of it, agreed to work to make up those additional days, to improve and increase the opportunities for members to represent their communities. We had the additional sitting days in November. I note that the member for Orange doesn't think that that was substantial enough for the issues that were faced earlier in the year during the Delta lockout, during the Delta outbreak. But we've acknowledged that time and time again. And the former Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, it was her strong leadership that saw us, this state, through multiple waves of COVID. She said at the time, she said on many occasions, she wouldn't get every decision right, and that she would listen to the community. She would listen to the member for Orange, she would listen to the member for Barwon, she would listen to every member in this place and across our community, and she would make the changes necessary if we didn't get things right, and that's what she did. And what we've done as a government throughout the pandemic, throughout every lockdown, throughout every furlough or impact, is we have stood by our community and we have made decisions, changed decisions, tweaked restrictions and settings to make sure we're doing the best that we can. But we've also had significant financial support packages, including for hairdressers like the one the member for Orange mentioned in his contribution. And we should. We should be supporting our businesses in our community. We should be supporting people who are devastatingly impacted by the decisions of that our government has to make in the face of a 1-in-100-year pandemic. And that's what we've done. And I stand by the decisions that we made to do that. I stand by the support that we've provided to the community and that we are continuing to provide to the community. Our small business grants, grants for temporary visa holders and asylum seekers, refugees, women escaping domestic violence. I stand by these decisions, Madam Speaker, and this Parliament has stood by those decisions.
Thank the member for the North Shore. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Murray.
Thank you.
I would like to thank my colleague, the member for Barwon, for sponsoring this petition to the House. Although Parliament is now back in session, it's very important that we have this debate to make it crystal clear that a government should never shut down Parliament. Last year, when this government channelled their inner Donald Trump self and decided democracy didn't matter, it was the rural areas that were most hurt by the sneaky decisions that were made behind closed doors. The New South Wales government made new laws from Sydney with no consideration for people in the bush. No consideration at all. It is not a lie. It is the truth. New South Wales border communities were trapped between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, you told us to stop travelling to limit the spread of COVID-19, and then on the other hand, you've gutted the rural health care system. Many of our residents were fully dependent on Victorian hospitals and doctors, so we needed to cross the border for medical care. You know the border? That's the river, the Murray River, the border, which none of you ever considered. For years, the New South Wales government have been bludgeoning off the superior Victorian healthcare system. And you still do it today. You actually pay them. You pay them. Go and do your facts. Go and sort it out. Our Moama residents go to Echuca for healthcare. Wentworth people go to Mildura. Deniliquin folk go to Shepparton. How about you come out to the area and have a look? You're the Minister for Western New South Wales. Come out and have a look. But the New South Wales border restrictions, happy days, yep, we'll welcome you with open arms. But the New South Wales border restrictions were made behind closed doors with no parliamentary scrutiny, created havoc for us. People were prevented from going to their regular hospital for cancer treatment. They were stopped from going to work, from seeing their family. Rural New South Wales was abandoned by this city-centric government. You've never been over the Blue Mountains. Our vaccine rates were half those of Sydney for much of last year. Then, in your wisdom, the New South Wales government decided to strip vaccines away from rural areas to give them to Year 12 students in Sydney. Imagine that. My electorate includes the Far West Local Health District, the most Indigenous area in the state. The most Indigenous. Didn't think about them, did we? I've had people from Far West contact me to let me know the government cancelled their scheduled vaccine appointments so Sydney could get their doses. Happy days for Sydney. There was no way to scrutinise this outrageous decision to strip Indigenous and rural communities of their vaccines. We know the National Party... Parliament wasn't sitting, so the betrayal of our First Nations people was covered up. We know the National Party always roll over to the Liberal Party in cabinet ways. They were happy for their own electorates to be disadvantaged. There you were, you were. You were. So these decisions deserve scrutiny and explanation in Parliament. It was in 2021, but the New South Wales government seemed to be the only organisation in Australia that couldn't work out how to work remotely. We all had to, and yet this Parliament couldn't do it. It was amazing. They expected every school in New South Wales and tens of thousands of students and teachers to work from home. But they said it was too hard for 140 MPs. We couldn't vote and we couldn't do points of order. Dear, oh dear. Honestly, in Australia, Parliament is the cornerstone of democracy. The people who signed this petition have made their views loud and clear. This government must never again be allowed to kill democracy. And I would encourage any of you city MPs to come out to the bush and actually speak to the people along the border and see how they feel about Gladys's decision then.
Order. Order. Are you seeking leave to make a contribution? No, you don't need to seek leave. Are you seeking the call? Yes, ma'am. Yep. So the question is that the House take note of the petition, and I'll call the Minister in reply.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I do thank the member for Barwon for bringing this petition forward. and I think he's done it in the right spirit. But there has been a little bit of unreasonable behaviour from a couple of your colleagues about some of the suggestions.
Order.
Well, just listen to what I've got to say. I mean,
Order.
if you're suggesting the only way decisions get made.
Just one moment.
Sure.
Firstly, when you're asked to be seated, please do so. Member for Murray, you do need to put your mask on in the chamber now that you've completed speaking. That's okay. Order. The member for Dubbo and Minister has the call. He'll be heard in silence.
Thank you, Speaker. The suggestion that the only way that democracy works is with people sitting in this building is ludicrous. We have all worked, as you have, through this pandemic. This is just a sledge-a-thon for no reason. You know you can work in your community without being in this building. We lost 12 days, 12 and made up 6. 6 days lost. 6 days lost. In November. In end of last year. The sittings happened. We all came back as quickly as we could to get on with the business of Parliament, but in the meantime, we were all in the community doing what we needed to do. So don't pretend that there was no way you could connect with your community, because you could. You were all regularly...
Order!
Speaker, the members present were all regularly invited to be part of hookups with the Deputy Premier, the Health District, the Health Minister, as I was. I was in those with you together. You had input into what was happening. Now, decisions around a pandemic, yes, never seen before, but you were collegiately involved in some of those things and were offered the opportunity to provide feedback. Now, you were. Some of the assumptions you're making about business, yeah, it was tough. It was tough for everyone. You mentioned nail salons. Everyone had the same scenario. Pubs, hospitality venues of all kind impacted. Nail salons, hairdressers, all impacted. But some people didn't want to ever come back until there was no cases anywhere. And some wanted the ability to have 6, not 5. You can't please every single person in every single scenario. Decisions were made by professionals that were then rolled out. We all had input, we all had to communicate with our electorates, and we all did the very best we could to do that. I mean, where else would you rather be in the last 2 years than New South Wales? Seriously, think about it. This is the only place in the world that I would have liked to have been. Nowhere else in Australia handled this as well as us. We have managed the pandemic from a health perspective. We have kept the economy going, and we have supported businesses of all kinds. There's nowhere else you'd rather be. Going forward, yes, there are lessons that we've learned, but we have never had this in our lifetime. So we've done extremely well. So I think, suggesting that there was no way we could have done better is a little bit over the top. I think the spirit in which this is brought forward is to say we recognise that Parliament is a bastion we hold in high esteem, and I think all of us agree with that. But on the other side of things, I think we also respect that we all had a role to play, and most of us did.
I thank the member for Dubbo and Minister. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Barwon in reply.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, that was entertaining. I'd like to thank the members for Orange, Murray, Coffs Harbour, North Shore, and also the member for Dubbo, for their contribution. I would like to address some of the remarks made by government members. To the member for Coffs Harbour, I have never backed away from acknowledging ministers who are accessible, Madam Speaker. I've always acknowledged that they are, and the Health Minister is one of those very accessible ministers and certainly changed the health orders for me a number of times on request. So never stopped acknowledging that. But what I would say, it's not about that, it's about the lack of democracy for those people that might not have that access to be able to come and have those discussions. And I'd also put forward that SMSs and phone calls don't make it onto the Hansard. There's no public view, it's not transparent like the Hansard is. To the Deputy Premier and the Zoom meetings, I really thanked, you were in the same meeting as me, I thanked the Deputy Premier for those meetings. From memory there was 2 that I was involved in, and I don't think I missed any. So I don't know if there was others that perhaps you were involved in that I wasn't party to, but certainly the 2 that I was involved in were very helpful, and I thank the Deputy Premier for that. But it is not a substitute for Parliament sitting. To the member for North Shore, we did need to respond, and we did respond. What we didn't need to do was shut down or deny the voice of our people being able to come to this place, and that's the whole purpose of me speaking on this today, to make sure that we never get back to a situation where the residents of our state are not allowed to have a voice or not able to have a voice in the Parliament on the Hansard the way it's meant to be. You mentioned the health advice. Now, every day we were told what decisions had been made in secret or in private, and the decisions would come to us. We never saw the health advice. We never saw the evidence that was used to underpin those decisions, and that's something that I think, again, we should have been more transparent with the public. To the Minister, I'm not complaining about our ability to connect with our community. We have multiple channels and ways of doing that. This was about the ability to take those communities' concerns to this place and seek to have them addressed. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I thank the member for Barwon. The question is that the House take note of the petition. I'll put the question. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The debate on the 20,000 signature electronic petition regarding a request that the Legislative Assembly be recalled to discuss and vote on COVID-19 pandemic lockdown regulations and other business having concluded, I thank the members of the public who have been listening to this debate online.